Hey guys, tonight we're going somewhere glamorous, somewhere shiny and aspirational and completely unhinged. We're diving into the world of 1980s diet pills, those little capsules of optimism that promise to melt fat, suppress hunger, curb cravings, speed your heart rate to approximately that of a hummingbird on espresso, and make you a completely new woman by next Tuesday, not the gentle, oat milk, intuitive eating world of wellness you know today. I mean the real era, the decade when thinness wasn't just a beauty standard, it was basically a moral virtue, and the diet industry was handing out amphetamines with the casual energy of a breath mint. So, before you get comfortable, take a second to like and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And a massive, heartfelt thank you to the viewer who suggested this topic. You have no idea how many rabbit holes this sent me down, and I mean that in the best possible way. Your suggestions genuinely shape this channel, and this one was perfect. Leave a comment telling me where you're listening from and what time it is for you. Also, if you haven't found us on Spotify yet, the link is in the description. You can now let history disturb your sleep from basically anywhere. Now, dim those lights, flip on a fan for that soft white noise, slide under your covers, and let me ask you a few questions. Have you ever wondered what was actually in those little rainbow-coloured pills women were shaking out of bottles in the 1980s? Did diet doctors just hand out speed? Was there a point where the FDA looked at the ingredients list and said, this seems fine? Could you buy something called a rainbow pill at your local pharmacy and not even flinch? What exactly happened to the women who took them for years, and what does it say about a society that told them this was self-improvement? And what did it feel like to live inside a decade that simultaneously celebrated women's liberation and told women their bodies were a problem to be solved? Congratulations! You've just woken up in 1982. You're wearing a leotard over a turtleneck. Your thighs are a national concern, and someone just handed you a pill the color of a fruit roll-up and told you it would change your life. They were right, just not in the way they meant. Before a single pill was swallowed, a story had to be told, and in the 1980s, that story was told on every billboard, television screen, magazine cover, and Aerobics VHS tape within a 10-mile radius of any American woman. The story went like this: your body, as it currently exists, is not acceptable. It is too soft, too round, too comfortable with itself. It lacks discipline. It lacks dedication. It lacks the kind of jaw-dropping transformation that could, theoretically, be achieved if you just wanted it badly enough, and if you were willing to take a few steps, drink a few shakes, and maybe swallow a pill or two along the way. This wasn't a fringe message. It was everywhere, relentless and cheerful, delivered by smiling women in leotards who somehow made suffering look aspirational. The diet industry didn't create the desire for thinness out of nowhere, but in the 1980s, it perfected the architecture of insecurity, and inside that architecture, the pill business absolutely thrived. Let's talk about the specific flavor of the problem, because the 1980s didn't just want women thin, it wanted women thin in a very particular way: lean, toned, angular, with visible collarbones and a waist you could theoretically close both hands around. The soft, curvaceous silhouette that had been fashionable in previous decades was now medically reclassified as a risk factor. Your doctor might say it politely. Your magazine said it with before and after photos. Your bathroom scale said it every morning without the politeness. The message landed the same way regardless of delivery. You are a project. You are not finished. There is a better version of you available, and she is currently being blocked by this current, inadequate version of you. And here is the truly modern thing about it. The 1980s diet industry didn't just sell a product. It sold a self. The before and after photograph was the decade's defining commercial image, because it implied that the after person was a different woman. Lighter, yes, but also happier, more confident, more deserving of good things, more worthy of being looked at. The weight loss wasn't the product. The transformation of identity was the product. Weight loss was just the mechanism. You can see how this was brilliant marketing, and a complete disaster for actual human beings simultaneously. Television did its part with characteristic efficiency. Primetime shows of the era featured casts of women who, by any historical standard, were extraordinarily thin, and yet were regularly depicted worrying about their weight, joking about their diets, refusing dessert with an air of moral victory that the laugh track rewarded enthusiastically. The message was ambient. You absorbed it without necessarily watching for it. Thinness was virtue. Appetite was weakness. Self-control was the measure of character, and your body was the report card. The diet industry understood this perfectly. Its advertising didn't lead with health, exactly, it led with social belonging. The thinner woman in the commercial wasn't just healthier. She was happier. She was more confident in her swimsuit. Her husband looked at her differently. Her co-workers respected her. She had, in some ineffable but completely visible way, won. And you could win too for the price of a month's supply of whatever they were currently selling. What's remarkable, sitting with it now, is how total the saturation was. This wasn't a niche anxiety. This was the water. You swam in it whether you wanted to or not, whether you were 10 or 40, whether you were a size 4 or a size 16. The story the 1980s told about women's bodies was loud, consistent, commercially funded, and almost completely unchallenged in mainstream culture. And into that story, the diet pill industry stepped with enormous confidence and a very long list of products. The bodies, it had been established, needed fixing. The pills were ready to help. The word diet pill in the 1980s covered a breathtaking range of substances, and if you unpack the ingredient list of a standard over-the-counter weight loss tablet, you would find yourself reading something that sounded less like a supplement and more like a very confident mistake. Amphetamine derivatives, thyroid hormone, diuretics, laxatives, benzocaine, a topical anesthetic rubbed on the tongue so food would taste like nothing. Bulk-forming agents designed to swell inside your stomach and convince your body it was full, when it was, in fact, just full of paste. And then there were the prescription options, which added layers of genuine pharmaceutical aggression, fenfluramine, phentermine, and their notorious combination, combined into the drug that would eventually become one of the most catastrophic chapters in weight loss history. These weren't folk remedies from some forgotten corner of the health food store. They were prescribed by physicians, endorsed by clinics, and taken every morning by millions of women who had been told, in gentle but certain terms, that they needed to be smaller. Let's start with the stimulants, because they were the backbone of the enterprise. Amphetamine and its close chemical relatives work by flooding the brain with dopamine and norepinephrine, the same neurotransmitters involved in the fight-or-flight response. The effect on appetite is real. When your body thinks it is running from a threat, it is not interested in lunch. Your heart rate goes up, your focus sharpens, your mouth goes dry. And the number on the scale, with any cooperation from the diet component of the program, tends to go down. This works, for a while, in the way that a lot of things work for a while, right up until they don't. Then there were the diuretics, pills that increase urine production, dropping water weight fast enough to produce genuinely dramatic results on the scale within the first week. This was, from a marketing perspective, an extraordinary feature. Nothing sells a diet pill faster than a customer who loses 4 pounds in the first 7 days. Never mind that every ounce of it is water and will return the moment normal hydration resumes. The scale moved. The customer felt successful. The customer bought more pills. Laxatives played a similar short-term role, accelerating transit time through the digestive system, reducing the amount of time the body had to absorb nutrients. More importantly, from the customer's perspective, keeping the scale number satisfyingly low. The long-term consequences of laxative dependence, electrolyte imbalances, damage to the muscles and nerves of the colon, the eventual loss of normal bowel function without chemical assistance, were not featured prominently in any advertisement. Benzocaine products deserve their own special acknowledgement, because they represent perhaps the most literally numbing approach to appetite suppression ever marketed to the American public. You sprayed this stuff on your tongue before meals. It worked by making your mouth partially numb, reducing the pleasure of taste, and thereby, theoretically, reducing the amount you ate, because eating had become roughly as enjoyable as dental work. If you are trying to design a product that captures the decade's fundamental attitude toward pleasure, that it is a problem to be pharmacologically managed, benzocaine spray is your purest expression of the concept. The bulk-forming agents were arguably the most innocent items on the list, though innocence is relative when you are consuming a substance primarily designed to make you feel falsely full. Methylcellulose, konjac, various plant-derived fibers, they expanded in the stomach and signaled satiation to a brain that had not technically been fed. Harmless, mostly. Deeply sad, entirely. What united all of these ingredients, beneath their considerable differences, was a single operational logic. Interrupt the body's normal hunger signaling by whatever chemical means necessary, so that less food is consumed. The body, as we will discuss at considerable length throughout this script, had opinions about this. It registered these interruptions. It adapted, compensated, retaliated in ways that the ingredient list never mentioned. The pills worked on the body's surface. The body worked on a much longer timeline. Long before Fen-Phen became a household horror, there was an even more colourful chapter in prescription diet pill history, literally colourful, because in the 1950s, 60s, and into the 70s and 80s, certain diet clinics were dispensing what patients called rainbow pills, a cocktail of multiple drugs bundled together, each a different hue, to be taken at different times of day. They contained amphetamines for energy and appetite suppression, diuretics to drop water weight, thyroid hormones to speed the metabolism, laxatives to move things along, and sometimes digitalis, a heart medication thrown in for reasons that were, even then, medically dubious. Patients often didn't know what they were taking. They were handed a little envelope of multicolored capsules, told to follow the instructions, and sent home lighter in spirit and, with any luck, in body. The clinics offering these services ranged from legitimate medical practices operating in a grey zone of aggressive intervention to outright pill mills that saw overweight women primarily as revenue streams with very little pushback. The rainbow pill era has a particular kind of audacity to it that rewards closer examination. Here was a medical practice that looked, from the outside, like sophisticated multi-pronged therapeutic intervention, a cocktail approach, like the polypharmacy used in treating complex conditions. In reality, it was closer to a pharmacological blizzard. Throw enough chemicals at the problem in enough colors, and something will stick. The fact that several of the chemicals in the envelope were actively counteracting each other, stimulants raising blood pressure while diuretics dropped fluid levels, thyroid hormone accelerating a heart that was already being pushed by amphetamine, was the kind of detail that tended not to come up during the appointment. The physicians who ran these operations existed on a spectrum. At one end were doctors who genuinely believed they were helping, who had absorbed the era's cultural consensus that overweight was dangerous, and who saw aggressive pharmaceutical intervention as reasonable medicine. They read the same journals, breathed the same air, operated within the same professional culture that considered a patient's weight a correctable condition rather than a stable trait. Their intentions, in many cases, were sincere. Their methodology was nonetheless producing patients with elevated blood pressure, erratic heart rhythms, and a physiological dependence on stimulants they had been taking for years. At the other end of the spectrum were operations that can only be described as commercial. Patients were seen briefly. Prescriptions were written without adequate examination. The business model depended on volume and on the reliable human tendency to return when something appears to be working, and in the short term, rainbow pills worked, if you measured working by the scale and ignored everything else. These clinics sometimes operated outside the regulatory attention of state medical boards, and when complaints were filed, the boards were not always swift to act. Overweight was not widely understood as a civil rights issue. The women being harmed were often not the women whose harm attracted urgent institutional attention. The pills eventually attracted federal scrutiny. The FDA held hearings, congressional committees expressed concern. the most egregious combinations were gradually pulled from the market. But the basic operational logic of the Rainbow Pill Clinic, the quick appointment, the multi-drug prescription, the cheerful emphasis on results over risk, did not disappear with the specific formulations. It migrated, adapted, and reappeared in the Fen-Phen clinics of the 1990s, wearing a cleaner coat and carrying FDA-approved paperwork. The rainbow had faded. The underlying arrangement was perfectly intact. Amphetamines have a long, complicated relationship with the American female body, and in the 1980s, that relationship was entering one of its most brazen chapters. The love affair had started decades earlier. Amphetamines were first marketed in the 1930s as a treatment for depression, nasal congestion, and, almost immediately, weight. By the 1950s and 60s, they had become so widely prescribed to housewives seeking to stay slim and energetic that they earned the nickname "Mother's Little Helper," a phrase that captured, with grim accuracy, just how normalized pharmaceutical intervention in women's bodies had become. By the time the 80s arrived, amphetamine prescriptions had been regulated more tightly, but the spirit of the thing had never really gone away. The demand was there, the market was there, and pharmaceutical companies had spent decades learning exactly how to repackage the same basic impulse, suppress appetite, accelerate the body, make thinness chemically achievable under new names, new formulas, and new doctors willing to write the script. What made amphetamine use among women so culturally invisible for so long was the specific way it was framed, not as drug use in the way that term was popularly understood, but as medical management of a medical problem. The women taking these pills were not junkies. They were patients. They had doctors. They had prescriptions, with their names typed neatly on the label. They were, in fact, following medical advice when they took their little yellow pill each morning. And if the result was that they felt thin and focused and urgently awake and capable of running through a full day of errands without noticing they hadn't eaten, well, those were features. That was the product working as intended. The word addiction was not applied to them. Addiction was something that happened to other kinds of people, in other kinds of circumstances, for other kinds of reasons. These were respectable women managing their weight under physician supervision. The fact that many of them could not stop taking the pills without gaining back everything they had lost, plus additional weight their altered metabolisms had not started at, was a personal failing rather than a pharmacological reality. The framing protected the industry and cost the patients. The 1970s brought tighter scheduling of amphetamines under the Controlled Substances Act, a genuine regulatory intervention that made them harder to prescribe in quantity for weight loss. But the response of the diet industry was not to abandon the amphetamine model. It was to develop chemical substitutes close enough to produce the same effects while falling technically outside the controlled substance classifications. Phenylpropanylamine, diethylpropion, phentamine. Each one was chemically adjacent to amphetamine. Each one produced a recognizably similar physiological experience, and each one arrived with paperwork that established its technical distinctness from the thing being regulated. The revolving door between amphetamine and amphetamine adjacent continued spinning throughout the decade, and the women taking these pills rarely had the chemistry education to notice the difference. They noticed the pill was working. That was sufficient. The cultural glamour of thinness provided cover that made the whole arrangement coherent. When being thin is the most important thing you can be, and a pill makes you thin, questioning the pill requires questioning the premise. And the premise, that slimness was worth whatever it cost, was not a premise the 1980s was in any hurry to examine. You might think that the explosion of aerobics classes, workout videos, and fitness culture in the 1980s would have been good news for women's bodies, a shift from passive dieting toward active movement, from restriction toward strength. And in some ways it was. But in the broader cultural context of the decade, the fitness boom didn't replace diet culture. It layered on top of it, creating a new and exhausting set of physical expectations that required women to be simultaneously thin and toned, which meant that the old tools of restriction were still very much in play, now supplemented by the new obligation to also spend 90 minutes doing high-impact aerobics in a mirrored room while wearing a thong leotard. Jane Fonda, the era's most iconic fitness figure, openly discussed her own struggles with bulimia in later years. The workout tapes she sold by the millions were set to upbeat music and featured enormous smiles, but beneath the surface of 1980s, fitness culture ran a current of punishment. The idea that the body was something to be conquered, disciplined, and remade through sheer force of will. The aerobics boom deserves credit for the genuine things it gave women: a social space, a sense of physical capability, the endorphin reality of regular movement. But let's be honest about the context in which it arrived. The workout video industry was not primarily selling cardiovascular health. It was selling the body of the woman on the tape. The program was purchased as much as the philosophy. You wanted her calves, her waist, her general overall specific arrangement of visible musculature. The exercise was the route. Her appearance was the destination, and that destination remained squarely within the same narrow parameters the diet pill advertisements were pointing toward. This created an interesting doubling of pressure. The pre-aerobics diet culture had asked women to restrict. The aerobics era asked women to restrict and exercise intensively, a combination that nutritionists now recognize as physiologically counterproductive at the levels the decade was recommending, but which was socially presented as the responsible, disciplined, truly committed approach to self-improvement. Diet pills fit neatly into this ecosystem. The pill suppressed your appetite on the days when the exercise made you legitimately hungry. It gave you the energy for the 6 a.m. class on 4 hours of sleep. It allowed you to exist at a caloric deficit that exercise alone was constantly threatening to correct. The pill and the aerobics tape were, in this sense, complementary products, and the decade bought both with equal enthusiasm. The celebrity dimension accelerated everything, as celebrity dimensions tend to. When famous women discussed their weight, their diets, and their workout regimens in magazine interviews with the intimate specificity of a medical disclosure, they normalized the conversation and raised its stakes simultaneously. If she was doing all of this to maintain that body, what were you doing? What did your effort levels say about your commitment? The implication was always that enough effort, properly channeled, could produce the correct result, and if the result was incorrect, the effort had been insufficient. The pill was a way of supplementing your effort, of demonstrating to your own bathroom mirror that you were, in fact, trying hard enough. Jane Fonda eventually reckoned publicly and movingly with what the era had done to her relationship with her own body. The reckoning came years later, after the tapes had sold in the tens of millions, after the aerobics industry she helped create had become a permanent feature of American life. The women who had exercised alongside her, who had taken their diet pills and done their leg lifts and stepped on the scale each morning and tried, are still doing the reckoning of their own. When prescription access to amphetamines tightened in the 1970s and 80s, the diet pill industry didn't collapse. It pivoted aggressively and successfully to the over-the-counter market. The key ingredient in most of these new pills was phenylpropanolamine, or PPA, a stimulant chemically related to amphetamines, available without a prescription, and sold under cheerful brand names like Dexatrim and Acutrim. You could buy them at any pharmacy, any grocery store, tucked quietly on the shelf between the vitamins and the antacids. They were marketed with the kind of breezy confidence that suggested losing 20 pounds was a matter of simple chemistry. Take one pill before meals, eat a little less, and watch the results accumulate. Women bought them by the millions. PPA didn't work as dramatically as amphetamines, but it provided enough of a stimulant effect, slightly elevated heart rate, mild appetite suppression, a jittery, can't quite sit still energy to feel like something was happening. That feeling, it turned out, was the entire product. The over-the-counter transition was a stroke of commercial genius that the diet industry had been working toward for years. Prescription drugs required doctors. Doctors required appointments, examinations, the possibility of a physician who might ask too many questions or express concern about a specific patient's cardiovascular history. The over-the-counter model eliminated all of that friction. You walked in, you saw the box, it said it would help you lose weight. You put it in your basket next to the toothpaste and went home. No consultation required, no discussion of contraindications, no moment in which a medical professional looked you in the eye and suggested you think carefully about this. The packaging was carefully engineered to communicate both scientific credibility and friendly approachability simultaneously. No small design challenge. Dexatrim boxes featured clean lines and authoritative typography that said this is a real pharmaceutical product. The models on the packaging were women who looked exactly like the woman you were trying to become. The copy was confident and specific, clinically tested, appetite control, dietary supplement. The word supplement did a lot of heavy lifting in those years, occupying a regulatory grey zone that permitted efficacy claims while avoiding the scrutiny that would come with full drug status. The advertising campaigns that ran for these products throughout the decade were masterclasses in the soft sell. Rather than promising dramatic transformation, that was the prescription market's territory, the over-the-counter ads promised something quieter and arguably more insidious: support, help, a little extra push. The pill wasn't going to do the work for you, the advertising was careful to note. You still had to diet and exercise. The pill was just going to make it a little easier. This framing was brilliant because it placed the burden of outcome firmly on the woman while still extracting her money. If it worked, the pill helped. If it didn't work, you hadn't tried hard enough. The pill was blameless. You were the variable. PPA's safety profile was, for decades, assumed rather than established. The FDA had reviewed it and permitted its over-the-counter sale, and within the regulatory environment of the era, that approval was taken as an authoritative assurance of safety that the underlying evidence didn't entirely support. When the hemorrhagic stroke data emerged in 2000 and the FDA requested withdrawal, the industry moved quickly, but the decades of sales had already happened. The women had already taken the pills. The cheerful boxes were already in the landfill. The question of what had accumulated in the bodies of the millions of women who had taken PPA for years, casually and without medical supervision, was not one that the withdrawal process could retroactively answer. If the over-the-counter pill market was the casual, widespread face of 1980s diet culture, then the prescription drug Fen-Phen was its most dangerous ambition. Fenfluramine and phentamine had each been available for years as separate medications, but in the early 1990s, with its roots firmly planted in the decade of excess that preceded it, a study showed that combining the two produced significantly better weight loss results than either drug alone. What followed was a prescribing bonanza that, at its peak, saw Fen-Phen written for roughly 18 million Americans. Doctors handed it out not just to the severely obese, but to people 10 or 20 pounds over their ideal weight. Diet clinics opened on the model of the old rainbow pill operations, moving patients through quickly, writing prescriptions, and sending them home with the pharmaceutical combination that, for a few years, genuinely seemed like the answer to everything. It was fast, it worked, and inside certain hearts and certain valves, it was quietly doing damage that would not become visible for years. The study that sparked the Fen-Phen explosion was published in 1992 by Dr. Michael Weintraub, and it was legitimately impressive by the standards of diet drug research. A rigorous clinical trial showing that the combination therapy produced sustained weight loss over 3.5 years, significantly outperforming either drug alone or placebo. The medical community, which had been frustratedly searching for an effective long-term treatment for obesity, responded with enthusiasm. Here, finally, was something that worked. The coverage was extensive. The prescriptions began almost immediately. What happened next has the quality of a cautionary tale with unusually clear causation. The study's subjects had been carefully selected and closely monitored. The clinical trial context, with its regular check-ins, its exclusion criteria, its attentive research physicians, was nothing like the conditions under which the drug would be prescribed in practice. In practice, Fen-Phen was prescribed by general practitioners with 15 minutes per appointment, by diet clinics with minimal screening, by physicians who had read about the study's results, and responded to patient demand with commendable efficiency and incomplete scrutiny. The drug moved from promising research finding to mass-market product at a speed that outpaced the long-term safety data. The physiology of what the drug combination was doing to serotonin systems, and through serotonin to the fibroblasts that line heart valves, was not understood at the time of widespread prescription. This is not entirely a story of cynicism. It is partly a story about the genuine difficulty of knowing, in advance, what a drug does to a specific tissue over a long enough timeline. But it is also a story about the institutional conditions that make that difficulty worse, the financial pressures that accelerate drug adoption, the regulatory frameworks that approve without fully understanding, the clinical environments that deprioritize follow-up in favor of throughput. Fen-Phen didn't fail because the medical establishment was villainous. It failed because the medical establishment was human, operating inside a culture that wanted the pill to work badly enough to look past the things that weren't yet known. One of the most insidious features of the diet pill era was that the pills often did produce results, at least on the scale, at least in the short term. And that short-term success was enough to make millions of women loyal, devoted, evangelical. You took the pill, you ate less, the number went down, and the world treated you slightly better. Your clothes fit differently. Your doctor smiled and told you to keep it up. The cultural reward system was so immediate and so total that the costs, the racing heart, the sleeplessness, the anxiety that felt like your nervous system had been plugged into a wall socket, were easy to dismiss as side effects, minor inconveniences, the price of progress. What the scale couldn't measure, and what the medical establishment of the era largely wasn't looking for, was the slower, quieter damage accumulating underneath. Changes in heart rhythm, the beginnings of valve dysfunction, a metabolism that had been artificially throttled for so long it had forgotten how to regulate itself. The scale said success. The body was keeping its own accounting, and the bill hadn't come due yet. There is something worth dwelling on in the specific cruelty of the scale as the primary metric of the era's success stories. The scale measures one number. It measures it reductively, without context, the same number whether the weight lost was fat or muscle or water, whether the body losing it was in distress or thriving, whether the heart behind the ribs was functioning normally or beginning, quietly, to show the signs of something serious. The scale was the era's most trusted instrument, and it was measuring the wrong thing. Women who developed side effects from diet pills were often reassured by their doctors, by the product literature, by the culture, that these were normal, manageable, temporary. The racing heart was your metabolism speeding up. The insomnia was the stimulant effect, and you'd adjust. The anxiety was something you could address separately if it became a problem. The framework in which these symptoms were interpreted was one in which weight loss was the primary goal and everything else was secondary signal. The body was sending urgent messages. The cultural context was providing a translation that made those messages say something much less urgent than they were. Meanwhile, the body, true to its nature, was adapting. The metabolism that had been artificially accelerated was beginning to compensate, becoming more efficient, learning to do more with less fuel, preparing for the famine that stimulants were chemically signaling was underway. This adaptation would not show up on the scale for months, sometimes years. It would show up eventually in the form of plateaus, of the dose needing to increase to maintain the same effect, of the weight returning with a swiftness that felt personally insulting when the pill was finally stopped. The body was not failing, the body was functioning perfectly, doing exactly what it was designed to do when subjected to conditions of perceived scarcity. The scale, measuring none of this, kept reporting success. To understand how thoroughly the 1980s diet pill era penetrated American medicine, it helps to understand the clinics that grew up around it, dedicated weight loss practices that occupied a space somewhere between medical care and commercial enterprise, and which operated, in many cases, with a minimum of scrutiny and a maximum of enthusiasm. These weren't necessarily disreputable places. Many were run by licensed physicians, operating within the wide, loosely defined boundaries of what was considered acceptable treatment for overweight patients. The standard of care at many such clinics was simple: weigh the patient, take a brief history, prescribe the current pharmaceutical favorite, schedule a follow-up, in and out, in 15 minutes. The follow-up, if it happened, was largely to check weight loss progress and renew the prescription. Side effects were underreported, partly because patients had been told to expect them, and partly because the industry had no great financial incentive to investigate too carefully. The more weight a patient lost, the more satisfied they were, and the more they recommended the clinic to their friends. The diet clinic model was, in its way, a perfectly calibrated product of its moment. It answered a real demand with a commercially optimized process. The same way a fast food restaurant answers hunger with a streamlined kitchen, the patient wanted to lose weight. The clinic had a pill that produced weight loss. The transaction was quick, the exchange clear, the customer satisfaction measurable in pounds. Whether the measurement was the right one, and whether the transaction was producing durable benefit or deferred harm, were questions the model was not designed to ask. The clinics proliferated rapidly through the decade. They appeared in strip malls and medical office buildings, in suburban neighborhoods and city centers. Their advertising was direct and results-oriented. Before and after photos in local newspapers, radio ads promising medically supervised weight loss, referral networks among satisfied patients who had lost 30 pounds and wanted their sister to lose 30 pounds too. The word medically supervised did significant rhetorical work in this advertising. It distinguished the clinic from the drugstore shelf. It invoked professional authority. It implied a standard of care and monitoring that the actual clinic experience often did not fully deliver. The economics were straightforward. A patient who came in for a 15-minute appointment, paid a consultation fee, and received a prescription that required monthly renewal represented reliable recurring revenue. The drug itself was inexpensive. The overhead was modest. The margins were good. The emotional stakes for the patient, the powerful desire to weigh less in a culture that rewarded weighing less, ensured a steady demand that required relatively little marketing to sustain once the word of mouth began. The diet clinic, at its most mechanized, was a prescription renewal service wearing a medical coat. And millions of women, navigating a culture that had made them feel their bodies were problems requiring urgent professional attention, filed into those offices and did exactly what they had been told responsible, health-conscious women should do. Diet pills didn't exist in isolation. They were part of a broader ecosystem of weight loss interventions in the 1980s, and one of the most dramatic chapters in that ecosystem was the liquid diet craze. Specifically, the very low-calorie diet programs sold under names like Optifast and Medifast that reduced daily intake to somewhere between 400 and 800 calories, all delivered in the form of powder mixed with water. In 1988, Oprah Winfrey rolled a wagon of fat onto the stage of her show and announced she had lost 67 pounds on a liquid fast. The moment was cultural seismic activity. Optifast reportedly received 300,000 calls in the 24 hours following the broadcast. What received slightly less primetime coverage was the fact that Oprah regained the weight within a year, and later described the liquid fast period as one of the worst things she had ever done to her body. But by the time that reckoning was public, the liquid diet industry had already made itself a permanent fixture of the decade's landscape, frequently running alongside pill prescriptions as a 1-2 punch of aggressive restriction. The Oprah moment is worth sitting with for a moment, because it captures with extraordinary precision the specific cultural logic of the 1980s diet industry. Here was the most famous, most powerful, most beloved woman on American television, a woman who had built her career on emotional intelligence and authentic connection, and the moment that generated the most viewer response, the most phone calls, the most cultural energy, was not a story of professional achievement or personal courage. It was the story of her body becoming smaller. The wagon of fat was the detail everyone remembered. The 67 pounds was the number everyone cited. The complex physiological reality of what a 400-calorie liquid fast does to a human metabolism over several months was no one's headline. What liquid diets and diet pills shared, beneath their surface differences, was the fundamental model of aggressive intervention, the idea that the body's natural regulatory systems were the enemy, that weight loss required overriding them by force, and that the discomfort of doing so was not a warning signal but a sign of progress. Liquid diet programs produced the same kind of short-term scale success as stimulant pills, dramatic, visible, photographable. They produced the same long-term physiological consequences: metabolic adaptation, muscle loss, the rebound that felt like personal failure and was in fact physiological inevitability. The combination of the two, a liquid diet program and a diet pill prescription, was not uncommon in the era's clinical landscape. The pill addressed the hunger that a 400-calorie daily intake produced with predictable urgency. The liquid diet produced the rapid weight loss that justified the pill prescription. They fed each other, commercially and clinically, and the woman in the middle of the arrangement lost weight on a timeline that looked, from the outside, like success. What it looked like from the inside, the constant hunger, the stimulant anxiety, the shakiness of severe restriction, the way food had stopped being food and had become an adversary, is a story that the 1980s had very limited language for telling, and even more limited interest in hearing. One of the central selling points of stimulant diet pills was the promise of a faster metabolism. The idea that the drug was essentially upgrading your body's engine, turning up the heat on the furnace that burned calories. And in a narrow, short-term, mechanistic sense, some of this was true. Stimulants do raise the basal metabolic rate, modestly and temporarily. They increase the heart rate, they mobilize stored energy, they make the body run slightly hotter. But the metabolism is not a simple dial you can turn up without consequence. It is an adaptive, feedback-driven system, and one of its oldest and most reliable responses to perceived threat, whether that threat is famine, illness, or an amphetamine derivative, is to compensate. The body, in its deep and ancient wisdom, adjusts. It becomes more efficient. It learns to do more with less. And when the pill stops, when the stimulant is removed, the metabolism that has been running artificially fast doesn't simply return to baseline. In many cases, it drops below it, lower than it was before the pill, lower than it would have been if left alone, leaving women in a metabolic state where normal eating produces weight gain that feels not just discouraging, but physiologically impossible to stop. To understand why this happens, you have to understand what the metabolism actually is. Not the simple calorie-burning machine of diet culture mythology, but a vastly complex orchestration of hormonal signals, neurological feedback loops, and cellular machinery that has been refined over millions of years of human evolution with one overriding priority: keeping you alive. The metabolism's primary job is not to keep you thin. Its primary job is to keep you breathing tomorrow. When you introduce a stimulant that artificially elevates its output, the metabolism reads this as unsustainable. It begins conserving. It downregulates thyroid activity. It reduces the energy expenditure of organs that can afford to run a little quieter for a while. It increases the efficiency with which it extracts calories from food. All of this happens below the level of conscious awareness, reported to no one, invisible to the scale. The diet pill advertisements of the era showed a simple before and after. They did not show the after, the year following the program's end, when the adaptive metabolism was collecting its debt. Women who had taken stimulant pills for months or years and then stopped frequently found themselves in a metabolic environment significantly worse than the one they had started in. Their resting caloric needs had decreased. Their hunger hormones, disrupted by prolonged suppression, were signaling with unusual urgency. Their bodies, trained by months of artificial deficit, were prioritizing fat storage with an efficiency that felt punitive and was, physiologically speaking, precisely rational. This was not a failure of willpower. This was the metabolism doing its job under conditions it had been designed to handle, conditions of scarcity, of threat, of uncertainty about the next meal. The stimulant pill had told the body it was starving, the body had believed it, and now the body was making absolutely certain it never got that hungry again. The cruelest part of the metabolism story is its circularity. The woman who gained weight after stopping her pills was frequently told she needed to go back on the pills, or try harder, eat less, exercise more. The solution prescribed for the problem was the thing that had caused the problem, and the industry that sold the pills had no financial interest in explaining this clearly. Faster metabolism was the promise. Damaged metabolism was the outcome. The advertisement showed only the first half. The diet pill era did not restrict its attentions to adult women. The same cultural forces that told grown women their bodies were perpetual improvement projects reached younger and younger girls throughout the 1980s. Girls who absorbed the decade's beauty standards through every possible channel, from fashion magazines to MTV, to the cheerful, colourful packaging of products specifically marketed to them. Teen diet pills existed. Teen diet books existed. Teen weight loss programs, operated by the same companies running adult programs, had dedicated youth wings. Pediatricians sometimes prescribed appetite suppressants to adolescent patients under pressure from parents who worried about their children's weights, applying adult pharmaceutical logic to bodies that were still in the middle of growing. The long-term consequences of suppressing appetite and artificially accelerating the metabolism during adolescent development, the disruption to normal growth patterns, to hormonal regulation, to the development of a healthy relationship with hunger, were not, at the time, the subject of much serious study. They are now. The teenage body is not an adult body running at a smaller scale. It is a body in active construction, deploying enormous quantities of energy toward growth, hormonal development, bone density accumulation, and the neurological rewiring that makes adolescence simultaneously dramatic and developmentally essential. The caloric needs of a growing teenager are substantially higher than those of an adult of the same size. Suppressing appetite in a body that is in the middle of building itself is, to put it in the plainest possible terms, interrupting the construction. You are removing materials from a structure that is still being framed. The girls who took diet pills in their teenage years in the 1980s did so in an environment that offered them almost no countervailing message. The magazines they read were the same magazines their mothers read, featuring the same bodies, the same before and after photographs, the same editorial content that treated weight management as a universal feminine obligation that began more or less at puberty. The television shows they watched featured casts of women whose bodies represented a standard achievable, in many cases, only through restrictions severe enough to constitute a clinical problem. The culture told them to be thin. The pills were available. The math was straightforward. What the math didn't account for was what restriction does to an adolescent brain, specifically to the neural pathways being laid down during those years that govern the relationship between hunger, eating, pleasure, and self-worth. Adolescence is the period during which the brain is most plastic, most susceptible to the patterns that will become permanent. Teaching a teenage girl that hunger is an enemy to be chemically defeated, that eating is a problem to be pharmaceutically managed, that her body's natural signals are untrustworthy and require external override. These are lessons that the brain of a 15-year-old encodes with a thoroughness and durability that it will spend decades attempting to undo. The eating disorder statistics from the era are not coincidental. Anorexia nervosa and bulimia nervosa both spiked in the 1980s among adolescent girls. Researchers have traced multiple contributing threads: cultural beauty standards, the specific dietary behaviors being modeled by adult women, the physiological disruption of stimulant use during development. The diet pill was not the only cause, but it was present in the environment like a steady, low hum, teaching girls a lesson about their bodies that the decade had decided they needed to learn early. Strip away the marketing language, the before and after photos, the clinical terminology about appetite suppression and metabolic enhancement, and what you're left with is the lived experience. The actual, daily, physical reality of being a woman whose body was running on stimulants it wasn't designed to process indefinitely. The heart that beats too fast. The sleep that won't come or comes in shallow fragments. The anxiety that is indistinguishable from the pills themselves. A constant low hum of unease that makes the ordinary business of a Tuesday feel faintly threatening. The jaw that clenches at night. The irritability. The dry mouth. The sensation of being urgently awake at 2 a.m. with nowhere for all that wakefulness to go. Many women taking these pills functioned remarkably well by external standards. They went to work, raised children, maintained households, showed up to aerobics class. The internal weather was their own private business, and the culture had made very clear that a little discomfort was a reasonable price for visible results. Here is what a stimulant diet pill feels like in the first weeks of taking it. If the accounts of women from the era are any guide, you feel capable, focused. You are less hungry than you have been in years, or perhaps than you have ever been, and that absence of hunger feels, in a culture that has told you hunger is weakness, like a form of freedom. You have energy you haven't had in months. Your thinking is sharp. You get things done. The world has a slightly heightened quality, a mild urgency that is not unpleasant. You step on the scale and the number is going in the right direction. You feel, for the first time in a long time, like you are winning. Somewhere around week 6 or week 8, the feeling changes in ways that are harder to name. The energy is still there, but it has a different texture, less like vitality and more like voltage. You are not tired exactly, but you are not resting well either. Sleep comes late and leaves early. You find yourself snapping at people over small things and feel immediately guilty afterward, the guilt itself arriving with an intensity disproportionate to the offense. Your heart does something occasionally, a flutter, a brief acceleration, that you mention to no one because it stops almost as quickly as it starts, and because mentioning it might invite a conversation about the pills, and you are not ready to have that conversation. By month 4 or 5, the pill has become something different than it was. You are not taking it because it makes you feel good. You are taking it because you are afraid of what happens when you stop. You have seen what happens when you forget a dose, the heaviness that descends, the hunger that arrives with a ferocity that feels less like an appetite and more like a sentence. The pill is no longer an accelerant. It is a flaw. You need it to feel normal, and normal without it has been redefined as something you cannot access. This is the experience the marketing did not show. The before and after photograph captured the scale results faithfully. It did not capture the 2 a.m. ceiling staring, the jaw pain, the relationship with food that had curdled from complicated to adversarial. It did not capture the woman who was thinner and more anxious and less herself than she had been before the program began. She looked great in the after photo. That was the whole point. Not every physician in the 1980s was writing diet pill prescriptions with a smile and a congratulatory nod. A quiet but consistent strand of medical skepticism ran through the era. Doctors who looked at the evidence, examined the side effects, and concluded that the risk-to-benefit calculation simply did not hold up under scrutiny, particularly for patients who were not severely obese and for whom the health risks of their current weight were modest at best. These physicians published in journals, testified before regulatory bodies, and occasionally stood in their exam rooms and told patients that they would not prescribe something they believed would cause harm. They were, in many cases, drowned out by an industry with vastly more marketing resources, by a culture with an insatiable appetite for pharmaceutical solutions, and by the specific, urgent quality of patient demand in a decade that had decided losing 20 pounds was a medical emergency. But they were right, and the epidemiology that accumulated over the following years would prove it. The professional landscape for a physician who raised concerns about diet pills in the 1980s was not comfortable. The culture around weight in medicine was deeply entrenched. Excess weight was understood as a significant health risk, and treating it aggressively was considered responsible medicine. A doctor who declined to prescribe appetite suppressants could find themselves positioned as negligent rather than cautious, as failing their patients rather than protecting them. The patient sitting in the exam room had read the same advertisements, seen the same before and after photographs, and arrived with a fully formed expectation. To decline was to disappoint. To explain the reasoning was to wade into a conversation that the cultural context made extremely difficult to have clearly. Some of the skepticism was formal and published. Researchers throughout the decade produced studies documenting the side effects of stimulant-based diet drugs, the cardiovascular strain, the dependence potential, the metabolic consequences of prolonged use. These studies appeared in legitimate journals. They were cited in regulatory hearings. They were discussed at medical conferences. They existed in the same information environment as the prescribing data showing that Fen-Phen was being written for 18 million people. And somehow, the prescribing data won the practical argument while the safety literature waited for its vindication. Part of the problem was statistical. Side effects that occur in a minority of users are genuinely difficult to detect in clinical practice, where a single physician sees a limited number of patients and the adverse events that aren't yet understood aren't being systematically tracked. The valvular heart disease caused by Fen-Phen was not diagnosed as a pattern until an alert cardiologist at the Mayo Clinic noticed it in enough patients to constitute a signal. Until that signal was named, individual physicians seeing individual patients with individual symptoms had no framework in which to connect what they were observing to the drug those patients were taking. The skeptics who said the pills were dangerous were right. They were right before the mechanism was understood, before the valve disease was named, before the lawsuits were filed. Being right early, in medicine as elsewhere, is not the same as being heard early. The bill arrived on schedule regardless. The moment the 1980s diet pill era truly ended, not administratively or commercially but morally, can be located with some precision in 1997, when the Mayo Clinic published a study linking Fen-Phen to valvular heart disease. The finding was not subtle. An abnormally high proportion of Fen-Phen patients were showing signs of damage to the heart's valves, specifically the mitral and aortic valves, which regulate blood flow through the heart's chambers. The damage pattern was unusual. Pediatric cardiologists recognized it as resembling a condition more typically seen in patients with carcinoid syndrome, a rare tumor-related illness. The serotonin system, specifically fenfluramine's aggressive action on serotonin, was implicated. The FDA moved quickly by its own standards, requesting the withdrawal of fenfluramine and its close cousin dexfenfluramine in September of that same year. But by that point, millions of people had already taken the drug. The lawsuits that followed would generate one of the largest product liability settlements in pharmaceutical history. The bodies were already keeping score. The Mayo Clinic finding had a specific, devastating quality because of its location in the body. Heart valves are not peripheral. They are the architecture of the organ that keeps you alive. The valves of the heart, 4 of them, each a precisely engineered structure of tissue designed to open and close with every heartbeat, thousands of times per day, for an entire human lifetime, were being damaged by a drug that had been prescribed not to treat a life-threatening illness, but to achieve a cosmetically smaller body size. The asymmetry of this was staggering and remains staggering. You took a pill to lose 20 pounds. The pill damaged your heart valve. The valve required surgery to repair or replace. The surgery carried its own risks, its own recovery, its own long shadow across everything that followed. This was the cost of the transaction, and it had not appeared anywhere on the packaging. The mechanism, once investigators understood it, had a terrible clarity. Fenfluramine dramatically increases serotonin activity in the brain. That is how it suppresses appetite, by flooding serotonin receptors in the hypothalamus. But serotonin receptors are not located exclusively in the brain. They are present in cardiac tissue, specifically in the cells that line and maintain the heart valves. Chronic overstimulation of these receptors causes those cells to proliferate abnormally, to lay down extra tissue in a pattern that progressively distorts the valve's architecture. The valve thickens. It stiffens. It stops opening and closing properly. The heart has to work harder to push blood through a valve that is no longer doing its job cleanly. Over years, this leads to regurgitation, blood leaking backward through the damaged valve, and eventually, without intervention, to heart failure. None of this was visible on the scale. None of it produced symptoms that most patients connected to their diet medication. The shortness of breath on exertion, the fatigue, the occasional irregular heartbeat, these were the kinds of symptoms that women in a culture that dismissed women's medical complaints were often told were anxiety, or stress, or something to do with getting older. The damage was accumulating quietly for the years that Fen-Phen was on the market. When it finally became visible, it had been visible, silently, for a very long time. The withdrawal of Fen-Phen from the market opened a legal chapter as sprawling and significant as the pharmaceutical one that preceded it. American Home Products, the manufacturer of fenfluramine under the brand name Pondamin, and the makers of the diet drug Redux, faced litigation from tens of thousands of plaintiffs, women who had taken the drugs, developed heart valve abnormalities or pulmonary hypertension, and were now seeking accountability for what had been done to them. The settlement, which American Home Products agreed to in 1999, was valued at approximately $3.75 billion, one of the largest drug liability payouts in history. But the legal proceedings did something beyond financial restitution. They created a public record. They required the pharmaceutical companies to defend, in open court and in depositions, the decisions they had made and the information they had suppressed. They gave individual women the opportunity to testify about specific, embodied harm, the valve surgery, the shortness of breath, the fear. They made the damage visible in a way that no number of journal articles quite could. The internal documents that emerged through the discovery process were, for observers of the pharmaceutical industry, grimly instructive. Memos circulated within American Home Products in the years before the withdrawal showed that company officials were aware of cardiac concerns earlier than the public timeline suggested. Discussions of how to manage information about side effect reports, how to respond to physician inquiries, how to characterize the emerging valvulopathy data in ways that minimized alarm. These were the conversations happening inside the company while the prescriptions were being written in the millions. The documents did not prove malicious intent with the clean simplicity of a courtroom thriller. They proved something more familiar and in some ways more disturbing. Institutional decision-making that consistently prioritized the commercial interests of a profitable drug over the health interests of the people taking it. The women who testified in these proceedings were not abstractions. They were people who had gone to diet clinics in good faith, received prescriptions from licensed physicians, taken a drug that was FDA approved, and developed conditions that required open-heart surgery. Some of them had been told before the Mayo Clinic findings that their symptoms were unrelated to their medication. Some of them had been dismissed by physicians who did not yet have the framework to connect what they were seeing to Fen-Phen. Some of them had been told their shortness of breath was anxiety. They sat in deposition rooms and courtrooms and described, specifically and carefully, what had happened to their bodies. The legal process, for all its limitations, gave them a venue in which their accounts were documented, preserved, and attached to the institutional record of what the era had produced. The settlement funds were distributed through a claims process that became, in its own right, a study in the complexity of mass-tort litigation. Thousands of claimants with varying degrees of documented injury. A settlement structure that assigned different compensation amounts to different categories of harm. A process that took years and generated its own controversies about who was included and who was not. It was imperfect, as all such processes are. It was also the closest thing the era produced to a formal acknowledgement that something serious had been done to a large number of women who had been told they were receiving responsible medical care. Fen-Phen was not the only casualty of the diet pill reckoning. Phenylpropanolamine, the stimulant in Dexatrim, Accutrim, and dozens of other over-the-counter products, had been raising quiet concerns for years before the FDA finally acted in 2000. The specific trigger was a Yale University study linking PPA to hemorrhagic stroke, particularly in women. The study found that women who had taken appetite-suppressant medications containing PPA in the previous 3 days had a significantly elevated risk of stroke. The FDA requested a voluntary withdrawal, and manufacturers complied, pulling PPA-containing products from shelves within weeks. For the millions of women who had bought these pills at the grocery store and taken them casually, with no prescription and no physician oversight, the revelation was a particular kind of shock. These had been products that looked and were sold like vitamins. They had been assumed safe because they were assumed safe by everyone selling them. The reassurance, it turned out, had been made without sufficient evidence to support it. The hemorrhagic stroke finding deserves a moment of unpacking because the mechanism is specific enough to be genuinely unsettling. Phenylpropanolamine is a vasoconstrictor. It tightens blood vessels, which is part of how it raises blood pressure and produces its stimulant effects. In most users, this constriction is modest and temporary, the kind of blood pressure elevation that passes without incident. But in some users, under some circumstances, the vasoconstriction can produce a sudden, dramatic spike in blood pressure, severe enough to rupture a blood vessel in the brain. This is a hemorrhagic stroke, bleeding into brain tissue, and it kills or permanently disables a significant proportion of its victims. The Yale study found that women, particularly women who had recently started taking PPA-containing appetite suppressants, were at meaningfully elevated risk. The women who had been taking Dexatrim for years, who had bought it at the grocery store, taken it before meals, thought of it as a diet product rather than a drug, were not women who had been warned about stroke risk. The product label discussed standard stimulant precautions. It advised against use in people with high blood pressure or heart disease. It did not say, in language that communicated the actual stakes, that taking this pill to control your appetite carried a measurable risk of brain hemorrhage. This information was not on the packaging because it was not, at the time of packaging, officially established. That is a technically accurate statement that nonetheless fails to capture the full picture, which is that the safety of PPA had been assumed rather than rigorously demonstrated, and the assumption had been maintained across decades of sales without the kind of systematic safety monitoring that the scale of use warranted. The withdrawal happened in 2000, which means PPA had been sold in over-the-counter diet products for decades before the data caught up to the risk. The gap between the product reaching the market and the evidence establishing the harm it could cause is not a gap that occurred because the information was hidden. It occurred because the systems designed to generate that information, post-market surveillance, long-term safety studies, systematic adverse event tracking, were not deployed with sufficient urgency for a product that was generating significant revenue and satisfying significant consumer demand. The pill was popular. Popularity, in this particular regulatory environment, functioned as a form of provisional safety clearance. The relationship between diet pill culture and eating disorders in the 1980s is not a simple cause and effect story, but it is a story with enough threads running between its parts to constitute something more than coincidence. The decade that normalized stimulant use for weight control was also the decade in which eating disorder diagnoses, anorexia nervosa, bulimia nervosa, rose sharply, a fact that researchers have connected not only to cultural beauty standards, but to the specific physiological and psychological effects of chronic restriction and stimulant use. Diet pills disrupt hunger signaling. They train the body and the mind to ignore or suppress normal appetite cues. They create a feedback loop in which eating less produces positive social feedback and returning to normal eating produces shame. For girls and women already in vulnerable psychological territory, that loop could become a trap. The pill, a gateway not into a smaller, healthier body, but into a disordered relationship with food that would outlast the pill by years or decades. Bulimia nervosa was formally classified as a distinct eating disorder by the American Psychiatric Association in 1980. The same year the aerobics boom was beginning and the diet pill industry was finding its commercial footing. The timing is worth noting. The disorder had certainly existed before its formal classification, but the naming and the moment of naming exist in a context that is not coincidental. Researchers studying the rise of bulimia in the decade found it concentrated, particularly in women aged 15 to 35, women who were precisely the target demographic of the diet industry's most aggressive marketing, women who had been taught systematically and from multiple directions simultaneously that their hunger was a problem requiring management. Diet pills contributed to the eating disorder landscape in several distinct ways. The most direct was physiological. Stimulants suppress appetite, and appetite suppression, sustained over months, disrupts the hormonal machinery of hunger and satiety. When the pill was stopped, the hormonal rebound produced hunger signals of abnormal intensity. Women who had been managing their appetite pharmacologically for years were suddenly confronted with hunger that felt overwhelming, out of control, terrifying. Hunger that, in the eating disorder literature, is recognized as a precipitating factor in binging behavior. The pill had created the very appetite it promised to solve. The psychological contribution was equally significant. Diet pills encoded a specific lesson about food and hunger, that the body's natural signals were not to be trusted, that they required external chemical override, that eating in response to hunger was weakness and self-management through restriction was virtue. For women with the biological and psychological predispositions toward eating disorders, this lesson was not merely unhelpful, it was actively harmful. It provided a framework and a methodology and a cultural endorsement for the relationship with food that eating disorders produce. The pill was not the cause of eating disorders, but it was a significant current running in the same direction as those disorders, and it carried a great many women closer to a place they would not have reached on their own. The diet pill economy produced, as any sufficiently lucrative industry does, its share of extraordinary operators, physicians who built profitable empires on the specific intersection of patient desperation and regulatory permissiveness. Among the most notorious was a weight loss doctor based in Texas who, at the height of his practice, was reportedly prescribing Fen-Phen to patients in 15-minute appointments with minimal medical evaluation, collecting fees that made his clinics extraordinarily profitable, and accumulating enough prescriptions per year to be among the top 10 Fen-Phen prescribers in the country. He was not uniquely villainous. He was, in many ways, a logical product of a system that rewarded volume, that gave physicians enormous latitude in prescribing controlled substances for weight management, and that operated in a cultural environment where the urgency of thinness was so thoroughly normalized that aggressive intervention seemed not just acceptable but responsible. When the lawsuits came, his name appeared in depositions. When the press covered the Fen-Phen crisis, his practice was a useful example. He was the product of a system, and the system had worked exactly as designed. What did a high-volume diet clinic actually look like from the inside? Reconstructed from patient accounts and litigation depositions, the picture is consistent across multiple operations. You arrived, usually as a self-referral or via word of mouth from someone who had lost weight at this practice. You waited in a waiting room that looked like a medical office, diplomas on the wall, a receptionist in scrubs, the ambient authority of clinical space. You were weighed, you were given a brief intake form. A physician, or in some cases a physician's assistant or nurse practitioner, operating under a physician's license, spent a few minutes reviewing your history. If you reported no contraindicated conditions, a prescription was written. You paid the consultation fee. You left with the prescription. This entire process might take 20 minutes on a first visit and considerably less on subsequent visits, which were primarily about renewing the prescription and noting your progress on the scale. The fee structure varied, but was generally designed to maximize revenue from each patient interaction. Consultation fees, prescription fees, monthly maintenance fees, fees for ancillary services like dietary counseling or body measurements. These accumulated into a per-patient revenue figure that, multiplied across the volume of patients moving through the clinic daily, produced numbers that bore no resemblance to the economics of a typical medical practice. The diet clinic, at its most commercially optimized, was a prescription factory. The prescriptions were for drugs that could damage hearts. The patients were women who had been told they were receiving medical care. The physicians who ran these operations existed on a moral and legal spectrum that the litigation process made more visible without entirely resolving. Some were genuinely uninformed about the risks. They had read the prescribing literature, noted the approved indications, and prescribed within what they understood to be appropriate parameters. Some had access to the same safety signals the skeptics were raising and chose not to engage with them. Some were operating with the explicit knowledge that they were seeing far more patients than any safety-minded practice could responsibly serve. The legal outcomes varied accordingly. But across the spectrum, the common thread was a system that made these practices financially rational, that created the conditions under which a physician could prescribe Fen-Phen to thousands of patients without any institutional mechanism reliably intervening. The doctors who made fortunes were enabled by a regulatory and commercial environment that had prioritized thinness as a medical outcome worth almost any pharmaceutical cost. The 1980s diet pill industry was, among other things, a masterwork of strategic communication, advertising that spoke with enormous confidence about transformation and science, while being deliberately silent about risk. Dexatrim's television commercials featured cheerful women in pastel kitchens. Fen-Phen was marketed to physicians through materials, emphasizing efficacy data while managing the presentation of side effect profiles in ways that minimized concern. Diet program advertising consistently featured before and after photographs that collapsed months of complex physiological change into a single triumphant image. The language was always of control, achievement, science, and success. The language of cardiac valves, hemorrhagic stroke, and metabolic disruption was the language of the small print, the fine print. The print you needed a magnifying glass to read on the back panel of a box you'd already decided to buy. The asymmetry between what was sold and what was disclosed was not accidental. It was engineered, refined over decades of iteration, and it worked. Television advertising for over-the-counter diet pills in the 1980s occupied a particular visual grammar that is recognizable in retrospect as a genre unto itself. A woman, usually white, usually between 25 and 40, usually filmed in natural light that suggested health and warmth, described her experience with the product. She was not dramatic about it. She was matter-of-fact, slightly self-deprecating, the kind of friendly and relatable that advertising research had identified as maximally persuasive for the target demographic. She had lost weight. She felt better about herself. The product had helped, she noted, not done the work for her. She was careful to credit her own discipline, because the advertising had learned that women responded better to a narrative of personal achievement than to one of chemical solution. The pill was a tool. She was the craftsman. The scale reading was the proof. What these advertisements never showed was the timeline. The before and after photograph, the genre's signature image, presents two data points, a beginning and an end, and implies a narrative of clean, linear progress connecting them. What it omits is everything that happened between: the weeks of stimulant anxiety, the disrupted sleep, the afternoon heart palpitations, the gradual realization that the pill had become necessary rather than helpful, the metabolic changes accumulating invisibly beneath the scale's satisfying numbers. And then, beyond the frame of the after photo, what the image cannot show by definition, the after, the months following the program's end, when the metabolic debt came due and the weight returned, and the woman who had been the success story found herself back where she started, or somewhere worse, with no advertising campaign to explain what had happened. The pharmaceutical marketing directed at physicians operated with different tools but identical logic. Detail representatives, the pharmaceutical industry's sales force, visited physicians' offices bearing study reprints, sample packs, and the kind of carefully curated data presentation that emphasized efficacy numbers while framing side effect frequencies in statistical terms that required active effort to translate into clinical meaning. A side effect occurring in 3% of patients sounds manageable in a summary slide. It sounds different when you calculate it against 18 million prescriptions. The advertising never invited that calculation. It presented the data it was required to present and framed it as favorably as the regulations permitted. The regulations permitted quite a lot of favorable framing. What the advertising sold, ultimately, was not a pill. It sold a story about who you could be, a story in which your body was a problem with a solution. The solution was available and scientifically validated, and the only thing standing between you and the after photo was the decision to begin. It was a compelling story. It was told with skill and repetition and enormous financial resources. And it was, in the ways that mattered most, a story that was not true. While the diet pill industry was at its apex, there was, running in parallel and in direct opposition, a movement of women who argued that none of this was necessary, that the entire premise of the project, the idea that fat bodies were medical emergencies requiring pharmaceutical correction, was not a scientific conclusion, but a cultural assumption backed by commercial interest. The National Association to Advance Fat Acceptance had been founded in 1969. By the 1980s, it and affiliated groups were producing research, publishing newsletters, and making arguments that would not become mainstream for decades. They pointed out that the evidence linking modest degrees of overweight to mortality was far weaker than the diet industry claimed. They identified the documented harms of weight cycling, the yo-yo effect of repeated loss and regain, as potentially more medically significant than stable higher weight. They argued that the psychological damage of a lifetime of failed dieting was real, measurable, and costly. They were largely ignored, dismissed, or treated as ideological outliers fighting against obvious common sense. The diet pill industry had a larger advertising budget. Common sense in this case turned out to be purchased. The fat acceptance activists of the 1980s were making arguments that required, in their cultural moment, a particular kind of courage. To stand up in the decade of aerobics and appetite suppressants and say that the body you currently lived in was acceptable, not a problem, not a project, not a before photo waiting for its after, was to position yourself against a consensus so total and so commercially reinforced that it felt less like an ideology and more like simple reality. You were not fighting an opinion, you were fighting the wallpaper. Their arguments were grounded in actual research, which is worth emphasizing because their opponents consistently characterized them as merely emotional, as women who were rationalizing their failure to try hard enough. The data on weight cycling, for instance, was not anecdotal. Studies had documented that repeated cycles of loss and regain, the standard outcome of nearly every calorie restriction diet, with or without pharmaceutical assistance, produced measurable negative effects on cardiovascular health, metabolic function, and psychological well-being. The diet, in other words, was not a neutral intervention that either worked or simply failed to work. It was an intervention with costs, and those costs accumulated with each cycle. The activists pointed at this data. The industry pointed at the scale. The scale was more photogenic. The dismissal of fat acceptance arguments in the 1980s took several forms. The most common was the health argument, the assertion, delivered with medical authority, that higher body weight was straightforwardly dangerous, that the evidence was unambiguous, and that anyone claiming otherwise was prioritizing feelings over facts. This argument was deployed with a confidence that its evidentiary basis didn't quite support. The relationship between weight and health outcomes is significantly more complex than the 1980s medical consensus acknowledged, confounded by fitness levels, socioeconomic factors, the health effects of weight stigma itself, and the documented harms of the dieting behaviors the consensus was recommending. The activists knew this. The industry did not find it convenient to know it. What the fat acceptance movement created, in its years of relative invisibility, was an intellectual infrastructure, a body of argument, a vocabulary, a set of documented findings that later generations would draw on when the cultural moment finally shifted. The women who were right in the 1980s did not get to see their vindication in the form they deserved. But the vindication came, slowly and incompletely, as study after study in subsequent decades confirmed what they had been saying all along, that the diet industry's promises were not supported by long-term evidence, that weight stigma produced measurable harm, and that a person's worth was not, in fact, located on a scale. The moment a woman stopped taking a diet pill, whether by choice, by physician's order, or because the drug was pulled from the market, her body began a process of recalibration that the diet industry's marketing had conspicuously failed to describe. The weight, in most cases, came back. Not because the woman lacked willpower, not because she had returned to bad habits, but because the pharmaceutical intervention had never addressed the metabolic, behavioral, and psychological complexity of weight regulation. It had simply overridden it temporarily, and the body, with its long memory and its powerful drive toward its own equilibrium, resumed its original course once the override was removed. Studies following diet pill users over time consistently showed that the vast majority of weight lost through pharmaceutical intervention was regained within 2 to 5 years. For many women, the rebound brought them back to their original weight and then past it. A metabolic penalty for years of artificial manipulation. The pill had promised a new body. It delivered, in many cases, a body that was harder to manage than the one that existed before. The rebound was not a mysterious or unpredictable phenomenon. It was the predictable consequence of a physiological reality that the diet industry had strong commercial reasons to minimize. The body has a weight range it defends. This is not a motivational concept or a self-help framework. It is an observable biological fact produced by a system of hormonal regulators, leptin, ghrelin, insulin, peptide, YY, among others, that communicate continuously between the gut, the fat tissue, and the brain, constantly adjusting hunger, satiety, and metabolic rate to keep body weight within a range the body considers appropriate for its circumstances. Diet pills interfered with this system. They did not reset it. When the pill stopped, the hormonal regulators that had been overridden resumed their work. Ghrelin, the hunger hormone, which had been suppressed by stimulants, rebounded, often to levels above its original baseline, producing hunger that felt physically overwhelming and bore no relationship to actual caloric need. Leptin, which signals satiety and tells the brain that the body has sufficient energy reserves, had been operating in a pharmacologically distorted environment and now resumed signaling in a body whose fat stores had been depleted, producing what researchers call leptin deficiency signals, a persistent sense that not enough has been eaten, that the deficit must be urgently replenished. The body was doing precisely what it was designed to do. It felt, from inside the experience, like betrayal. The women who went through this rebound were frequently told by the same cultural apparatus that had sold them the pill that they had failed. The language of personal responsibility was deployed with its full arsenal. You stopped trying. You went back to your old habits. You didn't have what it took to maintain the results. This framing was not only wrong but specifically cruel, because it took a physiological process that was occurring independently of the woman's choices and attributed it entirely to her choices. The body was regaining weight because the body was designed to regain weight under these circumstances. The explanation that was offered instead, character failure, insufficient commitment, ensured that the next pill purchase felt not like a repetition of a failed strategy, but like a renewed attempt to fix a personal defect. The industry depended on this misattribution. The rebound was not a bug in the business model, it was a feature. While the heart valve story became the dominant narrative of the Fen-Phen disaster, partly because it was visually demonstrable on echocardiograms, partly because it produced straightforward diagnostic criteria, there was a second, more lethal finding lurking in the data: primary pulmonary hypertension, a rare and progressive condition in which the blood pressure in the arteries supplying the lungs rises to dangerous levels, straining the right side of the heart and, in many cases, proving fatal. The link between fenfluramine and pulmonary hypertension had actually been established before Fen-Phen became a mass-market drug. A European study in the early 1990s had documented the association. This information was known. It was in the literature. It was available to the physicians prescribing Fen-Phen in their millions of appointments and to the regulatory bodies overseeing the drug's use. That it did not produce a faster intervention is a finding whose implications extend well beyond the diet pill industry, touching the fundamental question of how medical systems weigh known risks against commercial momentum. Primary pulmonary hypertension is a condition that, before the Fen-Phen era, was rare enough that most physicians would encounter it only a handful of times in a career. Its symptoms, progressive shortness of breath on exertion, fatigue, eventually leg swelling, and the bluish tinge of inadequate oxygenation, are non-specific enough in their early stages to be easily attributed to other causes. Anxiety, deconditioning, middle age. The diagnostic workup required to confirm pulmonary hypertension is not simple. It involves echocardiography, sometimes right heart catheterization, a clinical index of suspicion that most physicians treating weight loss patients had no particular reason to maintain. The diagnosis was being missed, in part because no one was looking for it in this patient population. The European data that should have accelerated caution tells a story about the specific conditions under which medical risk signals are acted upon. The study linking fenfluramine to pulmonary hypertension was published in the New England Journal of Medicine in 1996, a high-visibility venue, not an obscure regional journal. It showed that the risk of primary pulmonary hypertension was elevated 23-fold in people who had used appetite-suppressant drugs, 23 times the baseline risk. In any other context, in any drug class not serving a market of millions of people with strong commercial motivation to continue using it, a finding of that magnitude would have triggered immediate and urgent regulatory response. In the context of Fen-Phen, it triggered concern, discussion, and continued prescription. The women who developed pulmonary hypertension from Fen-Phen faced a grimmer prognosis than those with valvular disease. Valve disease can often be surgically corrected. It is serious, it requires intervention, but it is addressable. Pulmonary hypertension is progressive and, in many cases, ultimately fatal. The treatments available in the 1990s were limited. Survival statistics for primary pulmonary hypertension were measured in years from diagnosis, not decades. These were women who had taken a diet drug, not a chemotherapy agent, not a last resort treatment for a life-threatening illness, but a drug prescribed to make them smaller and who were dying from it. The pill had promised them a better body. The body it delivered had a prognosis. At the core of the Fen-Phen litigation, and at the core of the broader ethical accounting of the diet pill era, is a question about information, about what the women who took these drugs knew versus what they were entitled to know. Informed consent, as a medical legal concept, requires that patients receive adequate information about the risks of a treatment before agreeing to undergo it. In the diet clinic environment of the 1980s and early 90s, the informed consent process was often perfunctory at best and, in many cases, essentially fictional. Women were told that a medication would help them lose weight. They were told it was FDA approved. They were told there were side effects, and those side effects were described in terms that conveyed mild inconvenience rather than potential cardiac damage. They were not told, in language that communicated the actual stakes, that a drug prescribed for cosmetic weight loss might damage their heart valves or kill them with pulmonary hypertension. Many of them were taking the drug to lose 15 pounds. The transaction was profoundly unequal, and its inequality was not accidental. Informed consent in a clinical setting is only as good as the information being conveyed, and the information being conveyed is only as good as what the physician dispensing it knows and chooses to communicate. In the Fen-Phen era, both of those conditions failed simultaneously. Physicians in high-volume diet clinics frequently did not know the full scope of the drug's risks, partly because the safety data was still emerging, partly because the pharmaceutical marketing they had been exposed to had not emphasized the signals that were present in the literature. And even among physicians who were aware of concerns, the communication to patients often did not rise to the level that would allow a patient to make a genuinely informed choice. What does an informed choice actually require in a situation like this? It requires a patient who understands not just that side effects exist in some abstract clinical sense, but who grasps, in concrete human terms, what those side effects could mean for her specifically. A woman considering Fen-Phen to lose 20 pounds needed to understand that the drug was associated with a condition that could require open-heart surgery. She needed to understand that another associated condition could shorten her life by decades. She needed to understand these risks not as statistical abstractions, 3% of users, 23 times baseline risk, but as possibilities she was personally taking on when she accepted the prescription. Very few women received information in those terms. The consent forms that existed, where they existed, were documents designed for legal protection rather than patient understanding. They were signed quickly, in the context of a transaction that both parties were motivated to complete. They were not conversations. The gap between what patients were told and what they needed to know was not accidental. It was the product of a system in which the economic incentives of every party, except the patient, pointed toward minimizing the perceived risk of the drug. The manufacturer wanted prescriptions written. The clinic wanted fees collected. The prescribing physician wanted satisfied patients who returned for refills. The patient wanted to lose weight in a culture that had made losing weight feel like the most important thing she could do for herself. In that alignment of interests, thorough risk communication was the one thing nobody was particularly motivated to provide. The withdrawal of Fen-Phen, the PPA recall, and the massive litigation settlements of the late 1990s constituted a genuine reckoning, but not quite the kind of reckoning that produces fundamental change. The diet industry did not conclude, on reflection, that selling pharmaceutical solutions to cultural problems was a bad business model. It concluded that the specific formulations of the 1980s and 90s had been bad products, and it turned its attention to finding new ones. The 2000s would bring orlistat, which interfered with fat absorption and produced, as a notable side effect, what its prescribers delicately called oily spotting. The 2010s would bring a new generation of appetite-suppressing drugs with cleaner safety profiles and aggressive direct-to-consumer marketing campaigns. The 2020s would bring injectable GLP-1 agonists, Ozempic, Wegovy, prescribed with enormous enthusiasm and, in some quarters, with a striking familiarity. The speed of adoption, the cultural celebration of rapid weight loss, the medical institutions running slightly ahead of the long-term safety data, the patients losing weight, and the bodies keeping score. History, in this particular industry, rhymes with unusual persistence. The orlistat era deserves its brief moment of acknowledgement because it represents a particular kind of pharmaceutical pivot away from the central nervous system, where stimulants had caused so much damage, and toward the gut, where the drug could theoretically produce its effects more locally and with fewer systemic consequences. Orlistat works by blocking the enzyme that digests dietary fat, causing approximately a third of the fat consumed to pass through the digestive system unabsorbed. The weight loss results were modest. The side effects were, as advertised, gastrointestinal, and the specific gastrointestinal side effect most associated with the drug, the leakage of undigested fat, was sufficiently vivid and socially mortifying that it generated its own cultural moment. The drug was real, the results were modest, the side effect was unforgettable. The industry noted all of this and kept moving. What did not change after the Fen-Phen reckoning was the cultural substrate on which the diet industry operated, the basic agreement, held at the level of advertising, medicine, and daily social interaction. That women's bodies required management and that pharmaceutical assistance with that management was legitimate medicine rather than a commercial exploitation of engineered insecurity. The body positivity movement of subsequent decades pushed back against this substrate more effectively than the fat acceptance movement of the 1980s had managed to do, achieving genuine mainstream cultural penetration and shifting the explicit language of body image in significant ways. But the pharmaceutical weight loss market grew, not shrank, in the years following the Fen-Phen disaster. The patients were still there. The demand was still there. The industry found new products and new marketing strategies and continued selling the same essential story it had always sold. Your body is a problem, and we have a solution. The GLP-1 agonist moment of the 1920s carries enough echoes of the Fen-Phen era to be worth noting carefully. A drug produces dramatic weight loss results. Cultural enthusiasm is enormous and immediate. Prescriptions spread rapidly from the severely obese to the moderately overweight to people whose medical need is debatable. Long-term safety data is incomplete at the moment of mass adoption. The medical establishment is running on evidence that is real but partial. The patients are losing weight and feeling, in the short term, like they have finally found the thing that works. History is not necessarily repeating, but it is doing something that rhymes closely enough that the people who remember what happened last time are paying close attention. One of the more under-examined chapters of the Fen-Phen story involves the physicians and researchers who, at various points during the drug's commercial peak, raised specific, documented concerns through legitimate scientific channels and found those concerns absorbed, reframed, or marginalized by a system with strong financial interests in the status quo. Some filed reports with the FDA. Some published in journals. Some testified at depositions in the subsequent litigation about what they had observed clinically and what they had communicated to colleagues, to manufacturers, and to regulatory bodies. Their accounts create a picture of a medical establishment that was not uniformly complicit, that contained individuals doing what the system was supposed to do, but whose corrective mechanisms were too slow, too diffuse, and too susceptible to commercial pressure to function in time. The gap between the danger was known and the danger was acted upon was measured, in this case, in bodies. The cardiologist at the Mayo Clinic who first connected the emerging pattern of valvular abnormalities to Fen-Phen use was doing exactly what the medical safety system depends on physicians doing, noticing an unusual pattern in clinical data and reporting it through formal channels. The study that resulted, published in the New England Journal of Medicine in 1997, was the trigger for the FDA's withdrawal request. But the timeline of that discovery, from the first noticed cases to the published study to the regulatory action, took long enough that millions of additional prescriptions were written in the interval. The system worked, in the sense that the signal was eventually detected and acted upon. It did not work in the sense that detection and action happened before harm had been done at scale. The physicians who had been raising concerns before the Mayo Clinic findings were in a different and more difficult position. They were working not from a published epidemiological pattern, but from clinical observation, a handful of cases, an intuition, a concern that the drug's mechanism made certain outcomes physiologically plausible. In medicine, clinical intuition is not the same as evidence. It is the precursor to evidence. It is the thing that motivates the study that generates the evidence. But in the years between the intuition and the evidence, the drug continued to be prescribed. Because evidence-based medicine cannot act on intuition alone, and because the commercial momentum of an 18 million prescription drug is a force that clinical intuition is not well positioned to interrupt. Some of the most affecting testimony in the Fen-Phen litigation came from physicians who described the specific moment they understood what had happened. The consultation in which a patient presented with symptoms that, in retrospect, were unmistakable, and in which the prescribing physician realized that the drug they had written had caused those symptoms. The medical training that prepares physicians for almost every difficult conversation does not prepare them specifically for the conversation in which they must tell a patient that they personally prescribed the thing that damaged her heart. The emotional weight of those depositions exists in the public record of the litigation. It is not comfortable reading. It is not supposed to be. Diet pills took many forms, and not all of them were stimulants. Running through the same era, with its own practitioners and its own casualties, was the use of thyroid hormone, either synthetic or desiccated, as a weight loss tool. The thyroid regulates the body's metabolic rate, and an underactive thyroid produces weight gain. The logic of prescribing thyroid hormone to women without thyroid deficiency was that it would accelerate metabolism and promote weight loss, even in people with normal thyroid function. This was, by any standard of evidence-based medicine, a genuinely bad idea. Taking exogenous thyroid hormone when your own thyroid is functioning normally suppresses your thyroid's activity. The potential consequences, atrial fibrillation, bone loss, symptoms of hyperthyroidism including heart palpitations and anxiety, were not theoretical. They were documented. They appeared in the literature, and the prescription continued in diet clinics and in some general practice offices throughout the era, because the results on the scale were real and the patients were grateful and the damage was slow enough to be attributed to other causes. The thyroid is not a simple metabolic dial, despite the diet industry's persistent treatment of it as such. It is a gland whose hormone output is regulated by a feedback loop involving the pituitary gland and the hypothalamus, a cascade of signals that continuously monitors circulating thyroid hormone levels and adjusts production accordingly. Introduce synthetic thyroid hormone from outside, and the feedback system reads the elevated circulating levels as overproduction and responds by suppressing the gland's own output. The thyroid, receiving the signal that it is producing too much, produces less. In some cases, with prolonged suppression, the gland's ability to resume normal production is compromised. The woman who is prescribed thyroid hormone to speed her metabolism might end the treatment with a metabolism that is slower than before and a thyroid gland that has been functionally damaged by years of artificial override. The metabolism dream, pursued through thyroid manipulation, produced in some cases a metabolic nightmare. The bone loss consequence of thyroid excess deserves particular attention because its timeline is slow enough that the connection to the medication is often invisible to both patient and physician. Excess thyroid hormone accelerates bone turnover, the continuous process by which old bone tissue is broken down and replaced. When this process is chronically accelerated, breakdown outpaces replacement, and bone density gradually decreases. The result, over years and decades, is an elevated risk of fracture that arrives typically in middle age or beyond, long after the diet pills have been forgotten, long after the prescribing physician has moved on, in a body that has simply become, without explanation, fragile. The woman who took thyroid medication in her 30s to lose 20 pounds may have discovered the cost in her 60s when she broke her hip falling in the kitchen. The bill arrived on a very long delay. The atrial fibrillation risk was less delayed. Hyperthyroidism, whether from overactive thyroid disease or from exogenous hormone excess, is a well-established risk factor for atrial fibrillation, an abnormal heart rhythm in which the upper chambers of the heart beat chaotically rather than in coordinated sequence. Atrial fibrillation increases the risk of stroke and, in some presentations, causes symptoms distressing enough to require urgent treatment. Women prescribed thyroid hormone for weight loss who developed palpitations and irregular heartbeat were experiencing a predictable consequence of the medication's mechanism, a consequence that was in the medical literature, that was known to physicians who were paying attention, and that was not communicated to patients in terms that would have allowed them to recognize what was happening as a drug effect rather than a cardiac coincidence. One of the features of stimulant diet pills that received the least attention in the era's medical conversation was the question of dependence, specifically, the challenge that faced women who had been taking these medications for years when they tried to stop. Amphetamines and amphetamine-related compounds produce physiological dependence. The body adjusts to their presence. Removing them produces a discontinuation syndrome that can include fatigue, depression, increased appetite, and a rebound weight gain that feels, from inside the experience, catastrophic. These symptoms are not evidence of weakness or failure. They are the predictable physiological consequences of withdrawing a stimulant from a system that has adapted to it. But in the 1980s cultural context, in which thinness was a virtue and weight gain was a moral failing, women experiencing post-pill rebound had no framework in which to understand what was happening to them as a medical event rather than a personal one. The pills had created a problem whose solution was more pills. The industry found this arrangement quite satisfactory. The dependence that developed in long-term stimulant diet pill users was not typically the dramatic, visible kind that popular culture associated with drug addiction. The physical deterioration, the social collapse, the unmistakable behavioral signals. It was quieter, more respectable, more easily rationalized. The woman who had been taking Dexatrim for 3 years was not understood, by herself or by the people around her, as dependent on a drug. She was understood as someone who was managing her weight with medical assistance, the same way a diabetic manages blood sugar. The comparison was flattering to the pill and misleading about the nature of the dependency. Diabetes management addresses an underlying physiological deficit. Stimulant appetite suppression overrides a functioning system. When the management stops, the diabetic's underlying condition reasserts itself, and that is expected and managed. When the appetite suppressant stops, the hunger that reasserts itself is treated as evidence of the woman's inadequacy rather than as the physiological rebound it actually is. The exit problem was circular in a way that the industry's business model depended upon. A woman who tried to stop her diet pills experienced weight regain and hunger she found unmanageable. She returned to the clinic. The clinic prescribed more pills. The cycle repeated. This was not a therapeutic relationship aimed at achieving a durable outcome. It was a subscription model with a medical veneer, the patient returning, reliably, because the product had been designed to produce a dependence on continued use that the product's own marketing had framed as self-improvement. The woman who could not stop taking her pills was not, in the industry's framing, a person trapped in a pharmacologically created dependency. She was a person who understood that she needed ongoing support for a chronic condition. The chronic condition had been created by the support, but that part of the story was not in any of the brochures. The psychological dimension of the exit problem was as significant as the physiological one. Women who had organized their identity around their diet, who had, through months or years of pharmaceutical weight management, constructed a self-image predicated on the maintenance of a specific body size, faced a particular kind of crisis when the pills stopped working or were removed from the market. The body they had worked to achieve was not a body they could maintain without the pharmaceutical infrastructure that had produced it. The self that had been built around that body was suddenly without its foundation. This was not a trivial psychological event. In clinical terms, it looked very much like grief for the body, for the self, for the years invested in a project whose premises had turned out to be false. There is a category of harm that doesn't show up on echocardiograms or in pulmonary pressure readings, a harm that is real and documented and lasting, but that lives in the relationship between a woman and her own body rather than in any measurable physiological parameter. The diet pill era's psychological legacy is the inheritance of generations of women who spent their most formative years in a culture that treated their bodies as problems, their hunger as weakness, and their failure to maintain pharmaceutical weight loss as a personal shortcoming. It produced women in their 30s and 40s and 50s who cannot sit down to a meal without mental arithmetic. Women who describe their relationship with food using the language of conflict, fighting cravings, battling hunger, giving in. Women who can identify their weight on any given morning to within a fraction of a pound, but cannot describe, without extensive effort, what it feels like to eat until satisfied and stop. The pills are gone from the market. The mental architecture they helped build is considerably more persistent. The cognitive distortions that chronic dieting produces have been extensively documented in the psychological literature. Researchers studying the mental lives of chronic dieters, people who have spent years moving through cycles of restriction and rebound, find a consistent set of patterns that look, in their structure, very much like the thinking patterns associated with clinical anxiety, hypervigilance around food, the constant scanning, categorizing, and threat assessment of the eating environment. Dichotomous thinking. Food is good or bad, eating is success or failure, a day is on track or ruined, and the ruin is always complete and immediate. Emotional dysregulation around eating events, the disproportionate guilt after an unplanned snack, the anxiety preceding a meal in an unfamiliar restaurant, the specific shame of having eaten more than was planned that arrives with an intensity of no cognitive account of its origins can fully explain. These are not character traits. They are the predictable psychological consequences of spending years inside a behavioral and pharmaceutical regime that treated normal human appetite as a clinical problem requiring constant management. The brain that has been trained to experience hunger as failure does not easily unlearn that lesson when the training stops. The neural pathways laid down in years of diet culture are not erased by the passage of time or by a cultural shift toward body positivity. They persist, running quietly in the background, activated by the specific triggers that diet culture installed them to respond to. What makes the cultural cost of the diet pill era particularly difficult to assess is its invisibility to the women experiencing it. The woman who mentally calculates the caloric content of her breakfast before she eats it does not, in most cases, experience this as a symptom of something done to her. She experiences it as normal. She has been doing it since she was 15. Everyone she knows does it too. The cognitive distortion is so thoroughly normalized within the demographic that it requires significant distance, temporal, therapeutic, or both, to see it as something other than simply how women relate to food. The diet pill era did not create the culture that made these patterns seem normal, but it intensified it, extended it, gave it pharmaceutical infrastructure and medical authority, and the scale of an industry that reached tens of millions of women across decades. The mental architecture it left behind is not in any lawsuit settlement. It is in the daily lives of the women who lived through it. The women who took diet pills in the 1980s were not naive, were not vain, were not weak. They were people operating inside a culture that had made their bodies a site of intense social scrutiny, that had created a multi-billion-dollar industry to exploit that scrutiny, and that had handed them pharmaceutical products described as medically appropriate while suppressing or minimizing the evidence of harm. They lost weight, and they were praised. They developed heart conditions, and they were frequently disbelieved for years before the epidemiology caught up. They gained the weight back, and they were told they had failed. The reckoning that came in the late 1990s, the FDA withdrawals, the lawsuits, the settlements was real but incomplete. It addressed the specific compounds without addressing the specific conditions that made those compounds possible. A medical culture that treated female body dissatisfaction as a diagnosis requiring treatment, a regulatory environment that moved at the speed of litigation rather than precaution, and a society that remained, even after everything, fundamentally committed to the proposition that women's bodies were available for commercial improvement. The pills changed. The project continued. The accounting that the era requires is not primarily financial, though the financial accounting was at least attempted. It is moral, and it has several distinct components. There is what is owed to the women who had cardiac surgery for heart valve disease caused by a drug prescribed to make them cosmetically smaller. There is what is owed to the women who died of pulmonary hypertension for the same reason. There is what is owed to the women who spent decades in a metabolic environment their bodies would not have arrived at without pharmaceutical intervention, who eat carefully and exercise regularly and still cannot maintain a weight that the culture considers acceptable, because years of stimulant use altered the systems that govern these things in ways that have not been undone. And then there is what is owed to the much larger population of women whose harm was psychological rather than physiological, who are not in any lawsuit, who will not receive any settlement, who experience their inheritance from the era as a disordered relationship with their own bodies that they manage, daily, with effort and without recognition. What the women who were the market for the 1980s diet pill industry were never adequately given was the information that would have allowed them to make genuinely informed choices. They were given advertising. They were given before and after photographs. They were given 15-minute clinical appointments and consent forms designed for legal protection. They were given a culture that provided powerful incentives to accept those things as sufficient and powerful disincentives to ask harder questions. The information that the products could damage their hearts, that the metabolic disruption would outlast the pills, that the weight loss would not be maintained, and the attempt to maintain it would cost more than the attempt was worth, this information existed. It was available to the people making the decisions about what to market, what to prescribe, and what to regulate. It was not, in adequate form, made available to the women. What we owe them, across the decades, is first of all the acknowledgement that they were not failed by their own weakness. They were failed by institutions, pharmaceutical companies, regulatory bodies, medical establishments, and a culture that had collective obligations they did not meet. They were let down in ways that produced measurable, lasting harm, and the framing that attributed that harm to their personal choices rather than to the system that created those choices was wrong and remains wrong. The reckoning the era requires is still, in many ways, incomplete. The bodies that kept score are still keeping it. The least they are owed is the accurate account. When the lawsuits settled and the bottles were pulled from the shelves and the word Fen-Phen became shorthand for pharmaceutical disaster, the diet industry did not retreat. It redecorated. The language shifted with remarkable speed and remarkable skill, away from the clinical vocabulary of appetite suppression and metabolic enhancement toward the warmer, softer, more spiritually resonant vocabulary of wellness. The word diet, carrying by the late 1990s a freight of failure and legal liability, began to disappear from product names and program titles. In its place arrived lifestyle, journey, transformation. You were no longer on a diet. You were on a wellness journey, making lifestyle choices, investing in your best self. The pills were now supplements. The clinics were now wellness centers. The before and after photograph survived the rebrand intact, because some tools are too effective to retire, but it was now framed not as the documentation of a medical outcome, but as the celebration of a personal transformation. The product was the same. The wrapping was new. And the women who had watched their mothers develop heart conditions from the previous generation of products were now being sold the new generation in language designed to feel categorically different from anything that had come before. The wellness rebrand was a genuine masterpiece of marketing evolution, and it deserves examination because its effects are still entirely present in the world we currently inhabit. The shift from diet language to wellness language accomplished several things simultaneously. It moved the conversation away from the medical and regulatory frameworks that had produced the Fen-Phen disaster, because wellness is not a medical claim and therefore does not trigger the same evidentiary requirements. You cannot be required to prove, in a clinical trial, that a product promotes your wellness journey. You can be required to prove that it treats a disease. The industry, by reframing its products as wellness tools rather than medical interventions, stepped deftly out of the regulatory territory where it had been most vulnerable and into a space where the rules were considerably more permissive. The wellness vocabulary also accomplished a psychological reframing of the customer relationship that was, from a commercial perspective, brilliant. The diet industry's old language had a binary quality: you were succeeding or failing, on the program or off it, losing weight or gaining it back. This binary was commercially useful in producing return customers, but it was also culturally exhausting. And by the late 1990s, a significant portion of the target demographic had developed a complicated relationship with diet language. Specifically, wellness offered an escape from the binary. There was no failing at wellness. There was only the ongoing journey, the continuous investment in self-care, the humble acknowledgement that health was a practice rather than a destination. This framing was both more compassionate and, commercially, more durable, because a destination can be reached and the product's job ends, but a journey never concludes, and the supplements required to support it can be purchased indefinitely. What the rebrand did not change was the fundamental commercial logic that women's dissatisfaction with their bodies was an inexhaustible resource, that this dissatisfaction could be converted into purchasing behavior through the right combination of aspiration and anxiety, and that the product's actual efficacy was secondary to the emotional experience of using it. The wellness industry of the 1990s and 2000s was the diet industry of the 1980s, wearing a yoga mat and speaking in a karma register. The women it sold to were, in many cases, the daughters of the women who had taken Fen-Phen. They were purchasing the same promise their mothers had purchased, in new packaging, without the clinical language that might have invited harder questions. The industry had learned from its mistakes. The lesson it had learned was almost entirely about branding. There is a particular kind of inheritance that passes between mothers and daughters in families shaped by the diet pill era. Not wealth, not property, but something more intimate and more difficult to name. It is transmitted not through formal instruction but through daily observation. The way a mother approaches her plate, the language she uses about her body in the bathroom mirror, the specific quality of her anxiety before a family photograph, the casual arithmetic she performs over dinner that her daughter watches and absorbs, and eventually, without ever deciding to, begins performing herself. The daughters of the women who took diet pills in the 1980s grew up in households where certain relationships with food and body were simply the water, normal, ambient, unremarkable. They inherited not the pills themselves, which were gone from the market by the time many of them were teenagers, but the mental architecture the pills had helped construct. They inherited the anxiety without the historical context that would have explained its origins. They got the wound without the story of how it was made. The research on intergenerational transmission of disordered eating attitudes is extensive and consistent. Children, daughters in particular, though not exclusively, are significantly more likely to develop disordered eating behaviors when their primary caregivers model restrictive eating, express frequent body dissatisfaction, or treat food as a moral category rather than a nutritional one. The mechanism is not genetic, though genetic predispositions toward anxiety and perfectionism play a contributing role. It is behavioral and cognitive. The child observes, encodes, and eventually replicates the patterns she has watched practiced daily by the adult she most closely models herself on. The mother who ate half her dinner and called the other half bad is teaching a lesson she did not intend to teach. The daughter is learning it regardless. This transmission operated against a cultural backdrop in the 1990s that amplified rather than corrected what was being modeled at home. The heroin chic aesthetic of mid-decade fashion celebrated a specific, extreme thinness, with a cultural energy that made the 1980s aerobics ideal look almost wholesome by comparison. The diet industry, rebranded as wellness, was still running the same advertisements in new language. The scale was still in the bathroom. The daughters grew up with the specific combination of domestic modeling and cultural saturation that produces, in the eating disorder literature, the highest rates of body dissatisfaction and disordered eating behavior. They were inheriting an epidemic whose origins predated their own bodies. What the daughters also inherited, in many cases, was the specific metabolic legacy of their mother's pill use. Epigenetic research, the study of how environmental factors alter gene expression in ways that can be transmitted to offspring, is still a young field, and its conclusions in this area are preliminary. But the broader body of research on maternal health and offspring metabolism is clear enough to be taken seriously. The metabolic environment of the mother during her reproductive years influences the metabolic predispositions of her children. Mothers who had spent years in states of chronic restriction and stimulant-induced metabolic disruption were gestating in bodies that had been significantly altered by that history. What that meant for the daughters born from those bodies is a question that research is still in the process of answering. What is not preliminary is the psychological inheritance. The daughters are grown now. Many of them are in therapy, specifically, for the relationship with food and body that they traced, eventually, back to what they watched in their mother's kitchens. They did not take the pills. They received the pills' consequences anyway, delivered quietly, across the breakfast table, in the daily language of a culture that had decided their mothers' bodies were problems. They grew up, as their mothers had, being taught the same lesson. They are, slowly and with considerable effort, learning to unlearn it. And so here we are, at the end of a story that isn't really over, a story about pills and promises and the remarkable human capacity to want something badly enough to swallow almost anything offered in its name. Tonight, you travel through a decade that decided a woman's worth could be measured in pounds, and that the gap between who she was and who she was supposed to be could be closed with a little capsule taken before meals. You met the women who took those capsules in good faith, who walked into clinics, accepted prescriptions, trusted the white coat and the FDA approval and the cheerful packaging, and who discovered, sometimes years later, sometimes in a cardiologist's office, sometimes in the quiet devastation of a scale that refused to move, that the faith had not been warranted. You met the doctors who were right too early and weren't listened to. You met the daughters who inherited a wound they didn't have a name for. You met a reckoning that came too late and was still, in its way, incomplete. What the women of the 1980s diet pill era deserve, more than anything the legal system managed to provide, is to be understood as they actually were, not as cautionary tales about vanity, not as passive victims of forces beyond their comprehension, but as people navigating a profoundly rigged environment with the tools and the information they were given. They were smart. They were capable. They were living inside a culture that had decided their hunger was a character flaw, and they did what people do when the culture they live in speaks with that kind of certainty. They believed it. They tried to fix what they had been told was broken. The fact that nothing was broken, that the hunger was appropriate, that the bodies were not problems, that the entire premise of the project was false, is the thing they were most consistently denied the information to understand. There is something in the human story worth honoring even here, in this particular chapter of it. The resilience required to go through what many of these women went through, the cycles of loss and regain, the side effects they managed quietly, the surgeries, the diagnoses, the long, slow work of rebuilding a relationship with a body that had been treated as an adversary is not a small thing. They kept going. They raised children, maintained friendships, built careers, made dinners, and carried inside them a complicated private relationship with their own physical selves that most of the world never knew was there. They were tougher than the era that did this to them. That is not nothing. That is, in fact, quietly extraordinary. Tonight, as you settle into whatever comfortable arrangement of pillows and blankets and temperature-controlled air you have arranged for yourself, perhaps take a moment for two things. One is gratitude, not the performed kind, but the specific kind that comes from actually thinking about the distance between where you are and where someone else was. You have information that the women of the 1980s did not have. You have, hopefully, a slightly less aggressive set of cultural messages telling you that your body is a project requiring pharmaceutical intervention. You have, at minimum, the knowledge that those messages are messages, that they come from somewhere, that they serve someone's interests, and that you are allowed to be skeptical of them. The second thing is simpler. Be gentle with yourself tonight, with the body you are in, with the hunger you feel or don't feel, with the complicated, ancient, endlessly adaptive machine that has been keeping you alive through everything, through every exhaustion, every difficult year, every morning you didn't particularly want to face. It has been doing that work without your permission and without your applause, quietly and persistently, the same way the women of this story kept doing theirs. It earned a little tenderness. Sleep well,